Hi, welcome back to Module 8 of Networking Fundamentals. We're going to talk about networking services, so let's jump right into our agenda here. Alright, so we're going to cover two different objectives. We're going to talk about understanding network services, and we're going to detail common networking services that are available, and also understanding name resolutions, okay? Now, this is actually one of my favorite topics to discuss, so we'll just go over the name resolution techniques that are available. Alright, common networking services. So DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, is the protocol that enables your computer to obtain IP addresses automatically. And so the information obtained is probably going to include your IP address information about the IP address itself, a subnet mask, a gateway address for your default gateway device, your router, and then your DNS server address. Now, there are some other advanced features and options as well that can be included with the DHCP. Now, the server definitely provides a real reliable IP address configuration and also make it really easy for network administrators because, well, I wouldn't want to have to assign an IP address every time a device is connected to a network, not with all the devices that are out there in existence. So it's a really reliable service, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. So let's talk about the DHCP server and how that process works. It starts by leasing an IP address to a client computer after the following steps are performed. And so you see the steps there, right? Clearly, after you install the DHCP service on the server before it can be used, you configure an IP scope. Then you activate that scope and then authorize the server and then configure any other advanced options. And of course, those options are optional, right? But if you're a really good administrator, you're probably going to want to configure all of those advanced IP options as well. Let's talk about DORA. So DHCP sessions, when they begin, they use a four-step process known as DORA. It's simply an acronym. The first step in this process is discovering. That's when the client sends a broadcast to the network to simply find a DHCP server. So it says, hey, are there any DHCP servers out there, right? That's the discovery process. Now, next, the server is going to respond and send its unicast message offering an IP address to the client. Then, of course, we have a request where the computer says, hey, I would really like that IP address. Please send it over to me. Then the DHCP server sends a final unicast message to the client that includes the IP information. APIPA is another service, a networking service that makes things really nice for us. It assigns that unique IP address which starts with 169 when there's no DHCP server available, right? So APIPA can cause some troubles too because if you have an IP address or APIPA address, it makes it difficult for us to obtain IP addresses properly from the DHCP server sometimes, right? So when a client attempts to obtain an IP address, the DHCP server might be too busy or some other issue might come up, and so it will prevent a computer from accessing the internet if you have one of those addresses. But the good news is that you can use it to access and communicate with other devices on the local area network. Alright, next let's touch on, just real briefly, remote desktop services. Now, these are really useful so that you can access computers remotely across the network, right? We use remote desktop services to enable a virtual desktop infrastructure. And so this is session-based, right? We're able to access it. We can log onto our desktop remotely and then start a session and then just simply end the session, right? And we can use the applications. We could basically work from anywhere. And we use something called a thin client. It's a type of computer that doesn't have a lot of resources or a lot of intense hardware, right? It's thin, but we're able to use those computers because we're going to connect to the server that run remote desktop services which enable remote access. Next, we're going to discuss name resolution techniques. Now, I love talking about DNS. I think it's super fascinating. It's a worldwide service that resolves host names to IP addresses. So if we have www.udemy.com, we can go ahead and resolve that to an IP address and vice versa, right? DNS does the translation. Now, DNS's architecture is just hierarchical and distributed, and it has an associated set of protocol that define a mechanism for querying and updating a database, as well as an extensive database that aligns names with IP addresses, right? So it's very similar to like a telephone book that aligns telephone numbers with names. Another important thing for you to note is that DNS is part of TCP/IP, and the servers are going to use inbound port 53 to accept name resolution techniques. Alright, so that's it for this module. Just a quick recap of understanding network services. We talked about common networking services, right? And we also talk about different name resolution techniques with DNS. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a pretty quick one. So thank you so much for joining me, and I see you in the next module.